Marcus Ellison had spent years mastering the art of patience. From the time he was a young man growing up in a modest neighborhood of Atlanta, he had been told that to succeed, he would have to work twice as hard for half the recognition. Those words, once spoken by his grandmother, echoed in his mind now as he stood in front of the glossy oak conference room doors of Stratton and Pierce, one of the most prestigious investment firms in the city. He was on time, early in fact, dressed in a tailored navy suit with a silver tie that spoke of quiet authority, and holding a leather portfolio with documents that would shape the future of a $300 million partnership. Yet none of that seemed to matter when the manager, a wiry man named Gregory Shaw, stepped into the hallway with an expression that carried more arrogance than professionalism. "Sir, this meeting is private," Gregory said, folding his arms. His eyes darted briefly toward Marcus, lingering in that subtle, familiar way that carried centuries of unspoken prejudice. "Executives only. You'll have to wait outside." Marcus kept his posture calm, though inside, frustration simmered. He had been through this routine before. The look, the tone, the implication that he didn't belong in spaces where deals were made and futures were decided. He wanted to say something sharp, something that would slice through Gregory's arrogance like glass, but instead he simply adjusted his cufflinks and smiled politely. "I assure you, Mr. Shaw, I have every reason to be here." Gregory smirked, leaning closer, lowering his voice as if he were doing Marcus a favor. "Look, I don't know if you're with catering, security, or IT, but this is an executive-level negotiation. You wouldn't understand what's happening in there anyway." Then, without waiting for a reply, he slipped into the conference room and pulled the heavy door shut in Marcus's face. For a moment, Marcus stood still, staring at the wood grain of the door. Anger flickered hot in his chest, but years of discipline kept his jaw tight and his expression neutral. He had learned early on that exploding in moments like this gave people like Gregory exactly what they wanted, confirmation of a stereotype they already carried. No, Marcus would not give him that satisfaction. Instead, he drew in a deep breath, straightened his back, and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows of the lobby. He could see his reflection, poised, composed, powerful even when unseen. What Gregory didn't know was that Marcus wasn't just there as an observer or a guest. He wasn't a junior staff member, nor was he part of the support team. He was the CEO of Ellison Global Capital, the firm that held the $300 million contract Stratton and Pierce were desperate to secure. The very deal that would either save their company from sliding into irrelevance or catapult them into unprecedented growth. And Gregory Shaw, blinded by arrogance and assumption, had just locked the door on the one man who controlled their future. Marcus checked his watch, the silver hands ticking toward the meeting's start time. He could already imagine the moment the board inside would realize he wasn't in his seat, the silence that would fall when they asked where he was, and eventually the dawning horror when Gregory explained that he had turned away the very man they needed most. A quiet satisfaction hummed through Marcus's veins as he leaned back against the cool glass of the lobby window. Let them wait. Let them wonder. Sometimes silence was the loudest statement a man could make, but behind the calm exterior, Marcus was already planning his next move. This wasn't just about a door being shut in his face. This was about showing the entire room, and Gregory in particular, that no amount of prejudice could keep him from what he had built. If they thought a closed door could diminish his presence, they had no idea what kind of storm was about to enter once it finally opened. The meeting room on the 32nd floor of Strathmore Industries was buzzing with nervous anticipation as executives shuffled papers, straightened ties, and whispered among themselves about the big deal set to be signed that morning. The air was thick with both tension and arrogance, an environment carefully cultivated by men who thought their money and connections made them invincible. In the corner of the room, the manager, Greg Whitmore, checked his phone one last time, satisfied with his earlier decision to block entry to the black man who had appeared downstairs without a polished suit or entourage. To Greg, appearances mattered more than reality, And he had convinced himself he was protecting the integrity of the firm by keeping outsiders away from such an important discussion. As the clock struck 9, the massive oak doors swung open and a tall figure entered, followed by 2 assistants carrying sleek leather briefcases. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, chairs squeaked, and every head turned. The man walked with a calm confidence, his presence commanding respect before he even spoke. His name was David Cole, and though most of the executives didn't recognize him by face, they knew the name. He was the sole decision-maker behind the $300 million contract everyone in that room was desperate to secure. Greg's jaw tightened, a wave of dread washing over him as he realized the man he had dismissed earlier was now the very person holding their futures in his hands. David's gaze swept the room before briefly locking on Greg, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Without raising his voice, David greeted the room with measured politeness, his tone sharp enough to remind them all that he had nothing to prove. "I trust everyone here is prepared," he said, his words slicing through the silence like a blade. The executives scrambled to nod and shuffle their documents into place, desperate to appear ready. David, however, was in no rush. He moved deliberately, allowing the unease in the room to grow heavier with every second. Finally, he set his briefcase on the table and opened it, spreading out documents that bore his signature. He explained in clear, authoritative terms that the deal was structured to benefit not only his company, but also Strathmore, provided they respected the conditions he had set. Every executive nodded furiously, eager to agree, but Greg's face had turned pale, sweat forming at his temples as the reality sank in. The man he had belittled, the man he had blocked like some unworthy intruder, was the owner of the contract they had been chasing for months. David's eyes cut to him again, and for a brief moment, Greg thought he might collapse under the weight of that gaze. What unnerved him most wasn't anger. It was calmness, the quiet storm in David's demeanor that hinted at a reckoning still to come. Darius arrived at the sleek, glass-paneled corporate office building the next morning, his stride confident, but his thoughts sharp with focus. He had worked for years to build his company from the ground up, securing investors, landing breakthrough contracts, and finally establishing himself as one of the most respected negotiators in the industry. Today's meeting wasn't just another discussion. It was the culmination of months of careful planning, a deal worth $300 million that would open doors to international expansion and cement his company's reputation globally. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit, his briefcase in hand, and an air of calm determination surrounded him. As he stepped into the lobby, the receptionist looked up, startled, as though she hadn't expected him to arrive so early. "Good morning, sir," she said politely, though her eyes flickered with a hint of nervousness. He nodded, checked in, and headed toward the executive conference room. But just as he approached the frosted glass doors, the meeting already in motion inside, a manager he hadn't met before suddenly stepped forward, blocking his path with a stiff arm and a condescending smirk. "I'm sorry," the manager said firmly, his tone laced with arrogance. "This is a private meeting. Only key stakeholders are allowed inside." Darius blinked, momentarily stunned. He had every right, more than anyone, to be in that room. After all, he was the deal. He straightened slightly and replied evenly, "I am a key stakeholder." But the manager scoffed, clearly judging him not by his authority or position, but by his appearance. "Look, sir, this is a high-level business negotiation. Perhaps you've confused this with some other event. Delivery is downstairs." The man added smugly, jerking his thumb toward the service elevator as if dismissing him entirely. For a moment, Darius felt the familiar sting of prejudice, that sharp, cutting assumption that his skin color and calm demeanor somehow disqualified him from belonging in places of power. But instead of bristling, he simply adjusted his tie, his face expressionless, though his eyes burned with restrained fire. "You don't want to do this," he said quietly, his voice low and steady, but the manager only chuckled under his breath. Behind the frosted glass, Darius could see silhouettes moving, voices rising and falling. Executives already discussing terms of the very contract he had built from the ground up. The idea that they were negotiating his deal without him was infuriating, But he kept his composure. He would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing him flustered. Still, being shut out, treated as though he were invisible in a moment when his presence was not only justified but crucial, stoked a storm within him. He stepped back for a moment, pulled out his phone, and with a calm hand dialed a number that would change everything. "It's happening," he said softly when the line connected. "They've shut me out." On the other end, his most trusted advisor and legal partner immediately understood. "Hold tight," came the response. "We'll make them realize exactly who they just insulted." Darius ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and stood silently in the corridor, his posture regal, his eyes unwavering on the closed door. He knew the truth. No matter how hard they tried to lock him out, he held the keys to the entire empire. They just didn't know it yet. The boardroom of Dwyer Enterprises was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, a massive oak table stretched across the room, and portraits of the company's founding executives lined the walls. The air was thick with the weight of money and power. Robert Dwyer, the current CEO and heir to the empire, sat at the head of the table with his team of directors, each of them whispering among themselves as if they already knew the outcome of the morning's meeting. When the secretary walked in and announced that the investor had arrived, Robert didn't even look up from his tablet. He just waved a hand and said, "Finally, bring him in." The door opened and Malcolm strode into the room. He wore a sharp navy suit, his posture upright, his expression calm but commanding. A few directors glanced at each other in confusion, their whispers dying instantly. Robert looked up, his smirk freezing as recognition dawned. For a moment, silence hung over the room like a storm cloud. Malcolm placed a leather portfolio on the table and slid into a chair without waiting for permission, his every move a declaration that he belonged here more than anyone else. Robert forced a chuckle, trying to regain his footing. "Well, this is unexpected," he said. "I didn't know you were the investor we were waiting for." His voice carried a slight tremor, betraying the unease he tried to mask. Malcolm leaned back in his chair and looked directly at him. "That's because you never bothered to ask," he said coolly. "You assumed, and you acted on that assumption." Several board members shifted uncomfortably, sensing the power dynamic had already shifted. One of the directors, a woman named Eleanor, leaned forward. "Mr. Carter," she began cautiously, "it's a pleasure to have you here. We've been very eager to move forward with this partnership." Her tone was professional, but her eyes flicked toward Robert as if silently condemning him for nearly blowing the deal. Malcolm nodded politely, but kept his gaze fixed on Robert. "Eager, yes," he said, "but your manager at the hotel was not so eager to even let me into the room where this discussion was supposed to happen. He made it clear that people like me don't belong in meetings like these." Robert's jaw tightened. "I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding," he said quickly, trying to sweep the matter under the rug. But Malcolm's steady gaze didn't let him off the hook. "No," Malcolm replied, his voice low but firm. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was arrogance, and arrogance can destroy billion-dollar opportunities." His words landed like thunder in the room, and every director turned toward Robert, their faces betraying a mix of anger and disbelief. Robert cleared his throat, trying to shift the focus. "Look, Carter, we can't let one awkward moment derail what could be a highly profitable deal for both of us. Let's just move forward." But Malcolm wasn't done. He opened his portfolio and laid down a copy of his contract on the table. "I control the $300 million deal you're chasing," he said evenly. "I was willing to discuss terms, but what I'm not willing to do is work with a company that disrespects me before I even step into the boardroom. If this is how you treat potential partners, how do you treat your employees? Your customers?" The silence in the room deepened, and Malcolm could see the unease spreading like wildfire across the directors. They were beginning to realize that Robert's behavior had jeopardized not just this partnership, but the very reputation of the company. Eleanor broke the silence again, her voice firmer this time. "Mr. Carter, I assure you, Dwyer Enterprises values integrity and equality. If there's been a misstep, we will take it seriously." Her eyes cut sharply to Robert, who squirmed in his seat. Malcolm stood, gathering his portfolio. "Words are cheap," he said. "I'll see if your actions match them." He turned toward the door, leaving behind a boardroom that felt less like a place of power and more like a battlefield where Robert had just suffered his first defeat. Every director's eyes were now on Robert, not with respect, but with growing suspicion. The empire he thought he controlled was slipping through his fingers, and Malcolm hadn't even raised his voice. The boardroom felt suffocating with tension as Marcus calmly took his seat at the head of the long polished table, his presence commanding attention without him needing to raise his voice. The very seat where just yesterday the arrogant manager, William, had ordered him out of the meeting now belonged undeniably to him. A murmur rippled through the room as executives shuffled in their chairs, some avoiding eye contact, others whispering nervously about what had just unfolded. The reality was setting in for them. Marcus wasn't a junior employee, nor a subordinate they could dismiss. He was the controlling investor, the man behind the $300 million contract that their company had been desperate to secure. William, pale and visibly shaken, sat stiffly at the far end of the table, clearly wishing he could vanish. Just yesterday, he had ridiculed Marcus and had tried to humiliate him publicly. Today, he couldn't even bring himself to speak. Marcus looked around the room, his calm gaze resting on each executive as if weighing their integrity. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to gloat. The sheer weight of truth hung in the silence. Then he spoke, his tone measured but firm. "Yesterday, I was told I didn't belong in this meeting. Today, I'm here to let you all know that I own the meeting. I don't need validation, nor am I here for apologies. What I expect is respect, not just for me, but for anyone you think is beneath you." His words carried a quiet authority that struck deeper than any raised voice could. Several executives shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded, knowing full well that the company's reputation and future now rested entirely on Marcus's decisions. William finally tried to interject, his voice trembling. "Marcus, I had no idea." But Marcus raised a hand, silencing him without effort. "Exactly," Marcus said coolly. "You had no idea who I was because you never cared to look beyond your prejudice. That's the problem." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing William's. "And men like you don't just embarrass yourselves, you put your entire company at risk. Do you realize how close you were to losing this contract before it even began?" The sting of his words left William speechless. The atmosphere shifted further when Marcus pulled out a slim folder and placed it on the table. Inside were documents, ownership records, partnership agreements, and signatures that proved beyond doubt his authority over the contract. The room collectively inhaled as the reality settled like a storm cloud. Every executive in that room knew the implications. Marcus held the power to greenlight or cancel the $300 million deal with a stroke of a pen. Their fates, their careers, even the company's stability hung on his decision. For the first time, William realized he was not the gatekeeper. He was the one on the outside looking in. Marcus didn't shout, didn't gloat, didn't humiliate. He let the silence speak for him. He simply closed the folder, leaned back in his chair, and said, "I'll decide soon whether this company is worth partnering with. But know this, respect is not optional. It's the foundation of any deal I make." His words echoed in the stunned silence of the boardroom, and William knew that the ground beneath his feet had shifted forever. The next morning, the atmosphere in the corporate headquarters was thick with tension. Rumors of what had happened in the conference room the day before had already begun circulating through the company. Some whispered in hushed tones by the elevators, others traded nervous glances as they walked past Marcus in the hallways. He didn't acknowledge any of it. He had come with a purpose, and now it was time to bring his strategy into motion. Clad in a dark, tailored suit that fit him with authority, Marcus looked like the very embodiment of control and command. He entered the same boardroom where he had been denied access just a day earlier, only this time the seats were already filled with senior executives and partners who had been hastily summoned. The manager who had blocked him Robert sat stiffly at the far end, trying not to meet his eyes. The CEO sat at the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral, but there was a flicker of unease beneath the polished corporate calm. Marcus set his leather briefcase on the table, his movements slow and deliberate, letting silence fill the room before he spoke. "Gentlemen and ladies," he began, his voice steady and commanding, "yesterday I was denied entry into a meeting where critical discussions were to take place. Denied, not because I lacked the credentials or authority, but because someone judged me unworthy before I had the chance to speak. That act wasn't just offensive, it was short-sighted." A ripple of discomfort spread through the room, a few executives shifting uneasily in their seats. Robert finally raised his head, his face pale, but he said nothing. Marcus let the silence linger for a moment longer before continuing. "Now, let me make this clear. The contract on the table, the $300 million partnership you've been desperately seeking to secure, rests solely in my hands. I have the authority to sign it, to delay it, or to pull it entirely. And believe me, I am not a man who makes decisions lightly." The weight of his words settled heavily on the boardroom. The CEO tried to interject with a smooth apology, but Marcus held up his hand, cutting him off with calm precision. "This isn't about apologies anymore. This is about accountability. You built your empire on the backs of people you thought you could overlook, dismiss, or replace. But business doesn't work that way, not anymore. Respect, integrity, and equality aren't optional. They're fundamental. And if your team doesn't understand that, then this partnership is already dead." His words struck like a hammer. Executives who had once looked at him with dismissal now looked at him with something closer to fear and admiration. The CEO nodded slowly, realizing the balance of power had shifted entirely. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping lower but carrying even more weight. Robert thought he was stopping someone beneath him. What he didn't know was that he was trying to block the very man holding the pen that could decide this company's future. That's the danger of arrogance. It blinds you. But I don't operate in blindness. I see everything clearly. He snapped his briefcase shut and stood tall. "You have one chance to prove that this company deserves the deal. One chance. And it begins with Robert's resignation on my desk by the end of the day. Otherwise, you can kiss $300 million goodbye." No one spoke. The silence was so absolute it was almost deafening. Robert's face turned red, then ashen, realizing his career was finished. Marcus didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out of the boardroom, his footsteps echoing with finality. Behind him, chaos erupted. Executives whispering furiously, the CEO calling Robert's name, papers shuffling in panic. But Marcus felt none of it mattered. The tables had turned. The man they tried to keep out had become the very force deciding whether they thrived or crumbled. And that, Marcus thought with grim satisfaction, was exactly how justice was supposed to feel. The next morning, the company's boardroom was packed tighter than ever. Every senior executive sat stiffly, their faces pale, as whispers of last night's confrontation spread through the corridors. At the head of the table, Thomas adjusted his tie nervously, trying to regain the confidence he had lost. Just as he cleared his throat to begin, the glass doors opened, and in walked Jordan, his presence commanding the room instantly. He didn't need to raise his voice. His calm, unshakable authority carried farther than arrogance ever could. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said evenly, setting his leather portfolio on the polished table, "let's discuss the $300 million deal you almost threw away because of ignorance." The silence was deafening. Thomas shifted in his chair. His earlier bravado shrunk into nothingness as the reality of Jordan's influence sank in. Jordan spoke with precision, outlining how the partnership had been intended to not only generate massive profit, but also elevate the company's global reputation. "But when bias dictates behavior," he said sharply, locking eyes with Thomas, "opportunity slips away. That will not happen under my watch." Executives glanced nervously at one another. They knew who held the real power. Jordan leaned forward, his voice firm but steady. "I am not here for apologies. I am here for results. You'll work on my terms, or you'll watch your competitors rise while you crumble. The weight of his words left no room for argument. Thomas lowered his gaze, the humiliation of being exposed by the very man he had tried to dismiss burning deeper than any reprimand. The meeting ended not with Jordan seeking approval, but with the board members scrambling to prove their commitment to his vision. As Jordan walked out, his phone buzzed, his wife's name flashing across the screen. He smiled, answering softly, "Yes, love, it went exactly how it needed to." Because in that moment, it was no longer just about contracts or money, it was about setting a precedent. Respect wasn't negotiable, and leadership was no longer defined by titles, but by the strength to demand change when it mattered most.